realize it's been a hard time for everyone, but particularly to pastors. And I know so many friends who are pastors who expressed, just this tension right now. As things open up, you also realize that there is a cost to the sacrifice that the pastors had to give throughout the shutdown, and it hasn't been easy. So it has made it, I think, doubly challenging to think about what it means to lead, what it means to have a church in this post-pandemic world, and several interesting note about the book, because it is titled Art plus Faith, Theology of Making. We have to assume that it's about art plus faith, and yet I've gotten so many interesting notes from people who are not artists, people who have told me that the book opened their eyes to see their work, whatever that may be, as making, to replace the word work with the word making, and for us to even see the work of planting a church or serving a church as also work of making. And what the question is, what are we making? And so that was maybe not something that I wrote directly about. So I was just asked by Azusa Pacific Group. They had an event for pastors and worship leaders, and they asked me to write a little essay for them, directly addressing how does theology of making apply to the leaders. And that was a good exercise because I have been advocating, obviously, for artists within the church and outside the church for many years. And being an artist myself, I understand that that's a natural, perhaps, thing to do. And being a follower of Christ, you want to affect culture through the power and love of the Holy Spirit, and yet, I think I come at this book from a little bit of a broader perspective of sensing that the church, as we try to fulfill the Great Commission, has, it is again making of disciples, right? It is, what are we making? And what does making of disciples mean in terms of this context of culture wars and a culture that is driven by scarcity model rather than the model of abundance that Jesus speaks of, and how do we do that? And I can tell you that in my experience of being part of leadership, everything from Redeemer, Presbyterian Church, to all the church planting efforts that we've had over the years, to just in general, I go to an Episcopal church now, not because I agree with the theology, but I think what I'm trying to do is figure out this place of how the Spirit forms fruit in a missional place, and how an artist, a border stalker, that I speak about in my books, who may not necessarily fit into an institutional paradigm or a programmatic way of translating the gospel into everyday life. And I used to advocate and defend and try to serve from the borderlands to help the church understand artists. And then it just occurred to me that, when you read the Gospels, especially, and Jesus's life, Jesus completely a border stalker. Um, he is not what you consider a tribal leader, even though his tribe, the 12, and beyond, is certainly there. But the model seems to be of a movement mindset rather than institutional mindset. So there's a difference between thinking about how you make decisions if you want a movement, as opposed to if you want to preserve the institution. And I've been on both ends, and I can say I have properly failed at both to tell you that it's not an easy thing to do, or maybe that is part of the picture. Is that we try things and fails many times, and yet the gospel seems to urge us to keep going. And not just learn from that, but to see that as even some of the essence of how we are able to understand God's call. It's a prophetic call. It's not something that you can easily create a formulaic way of defining success. And so to me, this book came about because of my love for culture, but it also is at the heart of it is my love for the gospel. And I realized that from the borderlands, looking into this status of the culture at large and culture in the church, we are far from where this abundant life that Jesus is promising it can be manifested, and so it's a sort of an indictment that I had, I sensed in my own life, but it also in thinking about the broader church, thinking about culture wars, thinking about where the church is right now seen by the outside world. And in a place like San Francisco, it is extremely pronounced. You are literally in the eye of the storm, as it were, in terms of technology and creativity and imagination, and as well as marginalized communities. So it seems like the traditional model has failed to produce fruit. We have many programs, and spectacles, but they're not producing something that is would turn the despair of everyday city dwellers into joyous experience of forgiveness and reconciliation and love. And so, I think my book asks, why is that? And I start from the all sufficiency of God, as opposed to trying to prove these theological points. I'm an artist, so I don't write in a typical linear fashion, although I'll be preaching at a church next week, and I'll use 3 points. But in my book, I try not to do that intentionally, because I want the form of my writing to really embody this way of living that trusts the intuitive, what I call somatic knowledge, that flows from a body up. And to do that, you have to tell stories, as well as argue for theological principles. And I begin with the aseity of God, which means God is all sufficient. God doesn't need us. God doesn't need a creation, so why did God create? And the answer is God is love, and love creates. If you have been in love, you know what that means. It is gratuitous. It is unnecessary in many ways, the things that we do, but it is essential, because love demands us to go beyond the utilitarian pragmatism or industrial efficiency. It requires us to waste time together. Requires us to be generous beyond what is called for, and requires to seek the beautiful and what is transcendent. And so all these things point to God's creation, which is also gratuitous and abundant and extravagant and flowing with dimensions of the unnecessary, and somewhat useless things that doesn't make sense, in a utilitarian model. And even after the fall, the curse of the fall has certainly accentuated the gap between where we are as human beings and fallen humanity and this transcendence and goodness, but already the creation is already embedded in God's nature, of God's love. God's love holds the world together in that sense. So artists are tapping into that, and many of them atheists, and they hate the church, and they create out of sometimes out of twisted sense of their identity and their egos, and yet the expressions that endures because they take us to a place of transcendence, and they help us to dream. And to be inspired, and so the discrepancy sometimes between what I call plumbing theology, a very pragmatic way of preaching the gospel as fix-it model, and what Tom Wright, N.T. Wright, writes about so well in his books, that God's project seems to demand, it takes us more than a bullet points, and it is actually a feast. It is actually, pointing at a wedding feast, cosmic wedding. And that means artists are needed, right? I mean, wedding requires all sorts of art, and you have dance, you have poetry, you have gourmet, food and dance and so forth. So it really, I think that's a model that we can look at and say, where's the feast? Where is the abundance? And how do we align ourselves to that experience? And I understand that, we live in a fallen world and there are many idols, both within the church and outside of church. But that's not, those we can talk about. But that's not the starting point. The starting point should be, where is this fruit of the Spirit operating in culture today? And my observation, as I'm sure yours as well, is that it's hard to find. It's very difficult to find a group of people, community, that truly has love, peace, joy, patience, kindness, gentleness, faithfulness, goodness, and self-control, gentleness. Those are things that don't seem to exist. I mean, when you read, Paul's Galatians 5, it seems it's so convicting, because what Paul describes as the fruit of the flesh describes the church better. I was going through that recently. I was like, oh man, no wonder the world doesn't want to come to a church, We have all sorts of things happening, that get stuck in the fruit of the flesh category rather than fruit of the spirit. And I know that the news cycle is truncated, and it's not fair to say that perhaps to a genuine community that is doing their invisible sacrificial work. But you kind of think we should be doing better, given so much sacrifice and investment made toward that. And we have done individual work. Many of the fruit of spirit work has been individualized, and we ask this in discipleship, are you filled with the Spirit and so forth. But we don't ask, is our community filled with the Spirit, and what does that look like? Or, what does the culture look like? What does San Francisco look like if it's filled with the Spirit and start to produce fruit of the Spirit qualities? And where would that come from? And so I kind of turn the table to ask that question first. Same thing with creating an omelet, right? You don't, you taste the omelet to see if it's good, and then you go back to the recipe. But we tend to argue over the recipe first before tasting the omelet. So it's not even whether the omelet looks good or not. Does it taste good, right? And that's the starting point. And so it seems to me that we're not doing that. So we have all these conferences to argue over the right recipe and fight over each other, and I'm not saying those things are not important, but I think that's, and the academia has also been splintered and fragmented because of the kind of territorial battles that people fight, and they don't understand that true knowledge is in integration, and it's okay to have categories. It's just you have to work to integrate, and you have to work to speak beyond your particular zone. So I noticed that in denominationalism. I noticed that in so many ways, and I'm obviously very keenly aware of the difficulties of what I'm saying, but I think we do have to start by tasting the fruit first. So I'll stop there, and let's have a conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Mako. And obviously there's a few of us, so you can we don't even have to use the chat. We can just jump in.
Yeah.
Just in case these folks have not read the book, would you elaborate on one more point, and then I'll open up. But this notion of kintsugi.
Yes.
And particularly, I think it's Sinno-rikyu. Am I getting that correct?
Yes, you're correct. Very good.
First illustration you told of this famous tea master and the warlord, I mean, I was in tears reading it. I feel like it gave me a capacity in my soul to better understand this newness that you described.
Yeah.
And I would just love it if you'd share that with my friends here, and then we can pepper you.
Right. Yeah. And Journey of Theology of Making begins, as I said, with the God's all-sufficiency and the gratuitousness of creation itself and our existence. So I say that we really don't need to argue about the existence of God, have debates with atheists, because God doesn't need us to do that. That doesn't prove anything. It actually accentuates the point that you have to argue and win to prove a point, as if God requires that. It's a non sequitur for me, but it's nothing wrong with doing it. It's just that's not what God's existence is based on. God's existence stands alone, even without, and it is in existence before our concept of existence. There's no, way that we can fathom, understand this apart from the experience of love. And love, to me, flows through making, Adam naming the animals, to Moses' tabernacle, which was given at the same time as the Decalogue, showing us how important an object created beautifully, done with it, basically, craftsmen trained in Egypt, that God used Egyptian technology to create God's own tabernacle, which is like crazy. And then, Solomon's temple, and then Jesus, right? Jesus is, it says, we are the temple of God, and Jesus is the temple of God, and we are the bride of the bridegroom. So it's all about making, from Genesis to Revelation. So I point out many things, but one of the paradigms I use is kintsugi, because kintsugi is so profoundly about this journey of new creations through the brokenness. And so I want to emphasize that all of this, at the heart of it, the most central to this is the suffering of Christ, the resurrection. Very orthodox in this, and without that piece, and to me, for me, it's not the necessary just to be the evidence of the resurrection, which I think is important, and I think we can talk about, but it is that if God is true in this gratuitous creation of love, then there's no way that God is going to stay within the boundary of materialist universe and death itself be its final word. That's just conceptually, it's not what God does, because God's creation has already started an incredible, powerful movement to break us out of that, right? And the incarnation is this impossibility of this powerful God becoming human. And that means that this is a radical notion that, no matter how we spin it, and, we can look at all the archaeological evidence of the resurrection, that's not what this is about. This is about something that is so radically new that, the word kainos, when Paul says in Christ we're a new creation, that word kainos is not neos. Neos is another Greek word for new, but it's new iPhone. Kainos is a categorically new reality. So it's not neon, flashing in the night. It's newness is what I transliterate, and it's a new concept of newness. As an artist, I tap into that, I think, unconsciously at first, and then I harness all my discipline to trust my intuition to see if that can be manifested in some way in my work, and so I'm intuiting a lot of this, but this newness, is hard to understand. So kintsugi is a venerable tradition of tea. I have a 17th century tea bowl here, and Japan has many earthquakes, and so many of these will break. And instead of mending it, instead of just fixing it, that the Western mind will, something breaks, you fix it or you throw it away. But Japanese, starting around the time of Senno Rikyu, who was the grand tea master of 16th century, 17th century, 16th century, and then Rikyu's tea form became more pronounced and refined in 17th century. And this is happening right at the feudal wartime, where it was this intense, battles going on, literally battles, invasions, and there was no, sense of peace in the land of Japan. And this is happening right as the Christian persecution that went on for 250 years began. And I argue in my previous book, Silence and Beauty, that those two things are connected. So this broken teaware was mended by Japan lacquer master. And Japan lacquer is a notoriously difficult craft to learn. And but it was mended by a lacquer master, and instead of hiding the flaws, accentuates the flaws with gold. And so this part here in front, the river running through it, and then in the back here, all done with this careful re-scripting of the story of this bowl. And the resulting kintsugi bowl is more valuable than the original. And we have to remember that Jesus, in post-resurrection appearances, appear with his wounds. And this is a profound reality that Tom Wright, kind of talks about over and over again. It's just as far-fetched or hard to believe as the resurrection itself, is that Jesus chose to stay human. He could have been anything, right? I mean, he's resurrected. He's broke through the power of this materialist universe. He could have been anything. But he chose to stay human. After all that he went through in the 33 years of his life, the suffering that he went through, he said, I choose to be a human being. And that means that being a human being matters. That our suffering, our brokenness, all that we went through in the last year and a half matters to Jesus. That's shown in Christ's tears and his own encounter with human suffering, and his presence in the places of suffering. But not only he stays human, he is a wounded human. And this is like, how could this be? If you really think about it, stay with it long enough, because we want to run away from our traumas and move away from our ground zero experiences. And, we don't want to face the 20th anniversary of 9/11. I was a ground zero resident, and I'm just dreading that day. So, but that's what Jesus did. He went right to the heart of trauma, right? And he not only decided he triumphed over it, but he decided to come back in the marking of the trauma. And so I have to ask myself, am I willing to even consider that my own brokenness and my own trauma and what I went through is part of God's new creation or not? And if I am willing to do that, then, it's through Christ's wounds that I am healed. It's through his brokenness that we are raised. So that means somehow what I do and how I live my life and how I look at my past, everything matters in light of God's chosen way of showing up, post-resurrection appearances, and how the Spirit can operate in the fractures. Today's Pentecost. We are filled with divine gold in the fractures, and we are able to speak to each other, even though our languages are different and our culture is different. And that promise is a very much at the heart of, I think, kintsugi, which is not a Christian form, but I think it's connected. I think there's a theological principle behind Rikyu's aesthetic, which is Christological and has influenced a lot of this. So.
Yeah, thank you, Nancy. If you can jump in, I just want to say thank you for unpacking kintsugi, because I'm in tears again, and I think seeing the cup fully redeemed is such a different picture of what I would imagine, because I do have that replacement mindset of like, throw the old one away. God is making me into something new, and it's that refined newness, or the new newness, is just so moving to me. And I've never thought about Jesus choosing to remain human after the resurrection until just now. It's quite remarkable.
Yeah, it is.
Thank you.
I hate to even jump in. I feel like it's been a holy 20 minutes or whatever. And almost by jumping in, I feel like I run the risk of not landing in the right place.
Oh, no.
Because there's so much you've said. I'll just start off with two thoughts. When you talked about rather than hiding our wounds, to show them, so much of Moses hiding behind the veil.
Yes.
And he's not the only one that does that. And what are the ways in which we do that? And how can church do a better job of encouraging each other to pull the veil down? And it's okay that the glory's fading, because maybe in our human bodies, fading glory is all we get. And then in the beginning, when you talked about our work is our making, years ago, I was at a church in the Midwest, and I was working with post-college kids. And there was a man in his late 30s, early 40s, who took an early retirement for IBM and then volunteered almost full-time in our ministry. He was one of the quirkiest people you ever would meet.
Yeah.
My senior pastor was very adamant, don't you ever hire him? I'm like,
right.
I don't even know why that's not the main point.
Right.
He has more ties in his discipleship to our whole leadership strata in our ministry. But I remember one time towards the end of his life, because he died quite suddenly in a bus accident while he was discipling and running with these young guys. Long story for another day when we have wine in front of us. But he said, my definition of myself after all these years is I am an artist. And when he said that, I was taken aback, because he doesn't, not in any way, shape, or form does he seem like an artist. And he said, my canvas is people.
Yeah.
And when you talked about discipleship making, Larry came to mind. Yeah.
Yeah. That's what Vincent van Gogh said, the greatest work of art is loving people. Which means, Van Gogh, raised in generations of Christian pastors, Reformed pastors, wanted to be a pastor himself, and the church rejected him. So he became a missionary to coal miners, and the church office, they sent the officials to examine, because he was an evangelist under the church, and they said he lives too much like the poor, doesn't have the dignity of the office of a pastorate. So he was rejected again. And his paintings speaks of that pain, but also there are parables painted. He, instead of preaching a sermon, he painted. So every painting is a sermon, essentially. And that's what he said was, greatest work of art is loving people, and how true. Thank you for sharing that.
So let me ask you this, Mako. If you were a pastor for a year in a church, what are 2 or 3 changes you would make based on what you've just taken us through?
First of all, the church will fail immediately, so I would not do that. But
it's a hypothetical question.
Yeah, but I mean that in jest, but I also think that's precisely the problem. Is like somebody creative, like Larry, right, the person you were speaking of, or me now, is completely outside of the circle of leadership decision making, right? And I was an elder at Redeemer Presbyterian Church, and I was supposed to be inside, but there was no way that I could actually make a difference in the machinery, right? And that tells you that, I'm not blaming anybody for that. It's just a reality of our culture. And now I would say that there is an opportunity right now because of the shutdown and the pandemic, and everybody's trying to figure out what is the next step for, institutional leadership and also businesses, right? I've gotten calls from business gurus, and they haven't even read my book. I'm on this podcast kind of tour, so I assumed it was about my book, and I show up and they say, well, oh, you wrote a book? Like, no, I they said, we're like, I like train business leaders, and everybody's saying we have to think like an artist today. We have to be nimble. We have to turn things upside down. We have to, figure out like what is business, today, and moving forward, right? And so that's why I wanted you to be on the podcast, because you're an artist, and to consult in that setting. First of all, I'm not a business person, so I wouldn't know how to run a business or to operate it. I would, but what I do think is that we should be asking, as hard as it is to ask this question, what is the church, and what are we doing, and what are we making, right? If we're making an institution, it's what Malcolm Gladwell says is the strong links society is the ones that creates a pyramid and defends the top, right? And they want to, as much as they can, keep power of the top few. But Gladwell brilliantly observed in the beginning of the pandemic that we are going into a period of time where weak link society is going to function better. And how right he was, because it's the nurses, the Amazon workers, the people in front lines, the weak links became essential workers, right? And so that change happened in instantaneously. But now what, right? So we realize how important these people are. People who perhaps took for granted, people who, saw themselves at the lowest, ranks, but we realize like, oh, so Gladwell says, the strong links, society is like basketball. If you have LeBron James, not today, but today they lost. But you can make it to the playoffs, because your team might be not so good, but if you have one strong leader, you'll be able to carry the. But he says the weak links society is like soccer. It doesn't matter how good, if you have somebody, a striker who's exceptional, but it doesn't matter if that person is Messi. If you have a bad fullback, you lose all the games. So I think society has shifted. Right. So business has shifted. And so what does that mean? Now it's going to shift back, to the new normal. And the churches too, we're getting back and meeting together and so forth. But it is an opportunity to ask, like, what are we doing and what are we making? And to ask that question, it has to be localized, to particular community, particular city. It's not going to be, it shouldn't be a formula. So I would have to, spend time, breathing and eating with, people that are both in the leadership and the people they're trying to reach. And, I also think businesses don't do this. Like they don't actually spend time with their customers. So they have the successful model. My daughter worked at a HR in Taco Bell, and it was like, she was the only person who actually went to a Taco Bell to see how the workers were faring in, their communities.
Fascinating.
Yeah, so she noticed something, that this strange gap that exists, and I think same thing can be said for, many churches, right? It's hard because you're doing your, job description basically and protecting, the institution, so that means that you have less time to focus on the communities that you're sent to love. And we have deacons to do that. We have leadership ministries to do that. Parachurch comes in and they help to fill the gaps. But if it's a weak links economy or society or community, then which it makes sense for the church to be that, then the hierarchy has to flatten, and we have to be in the front lines. And how do you do that? How do you lead in such a way that you are literally able to empower the whole movement by doing that without burning yourself out? Yeah.
I'll just say one more thing, and then it'd be great to hear from other people, not just me. But as I'm listening to you, it just seems like a few thoughts I wrote down. We have to rethink our power distribution in our churches. When I think about Redeemer or any church like that, to have you on the elder board and not to take full advantage of that is just criminal.
Well,
how do we shift the power distribution in our decision making? The second thing is, when you talked about the essential workers, how do we tell stories in churches about ordinary people?
Yeah.
I remember going to our church one time, and it was so refreshing. One of the pastors talked about a couple in their late 70s who have 3 biological children, but just finished their 113th foster care baby.
Mm-hmm.
They only keep them for the first 6 months, but the pastor made a hero out of them instead of a celebrity type person.
Yeah.
I think for church pastors to gather, and maybe this is something Bart and Nick and TBC can talk about, how do we gather pastors together and have an ongoing conversation about what is the church coming out of COVID? What is God asking us to rethink? And then for pastors to ask that question every single week in front of their congregation. We are in the middle of discussing what is the church. We'd love to hear from you. So.
And what do you want to become, right? What do you want to make? That's a good question to ask.
How do we get together?
We often don't ask that. Like it seems silly to ask, but really, if that's the question, right? And I learned a lot from Redeemer, and I'm grateful for Tim's leadership, and he does ask that question. How do we become culturally engaged, making kind of a church? But the problem is it's kind of there's a categorical gap between that thinking, the vision of it, and the actual practice, because the model of the church is to to strengthen the institutional reality, and that it will automatically exclude people on the margins, border stalkers. They're the ones that sense that first, and they won't tell you that. They might be a pastor that is a border stalker that doesn't feel culturally fit into a mechanism. They'll stay because they love the church, but it's the artists in the margins that often can tell us what the true picture is as well. And so that's part of the challenge is we have all these segmented things. You have one thing I don't like is like to create an artist group, like these artists wearing black and sitting in the corner, let's just create a group for them,
get them together and push them out.
Exactly. Put them in a corner and they can talk about their problems and pray for them, and I'm like, well, no, that's the last thing artists need. Artists need like business leaders to visit their studios and buy their paintings. The pastors to come in the backstages when you just did this incredible performance as a dancer, and you're weeping because you can't do it again. Mm-hmm. That's when you need a pastor. Yeah. You may be faithful, you may go to church every week, but that's your stage. And that's where the Holy Spirit shows up, and you don't know how to handle yourself in the gap between your body breaking down and the transcendence that you just experienced. And so that we tend to segment the homeless. We tend to segment children. We tend to say like everything is segmented. So it's how do you bring the body back together in some way? I'm not saying that that should get rid of that. I do think that part of this nimble leadership that 21st century is going to require has to always be driven back to what are we making? What is our cathedral? What are we actually building together, and what do you want to do that? Sometimes people coming into the churches have so many broken pieces, right? And we might create programs for that, and to tell them that these are available, but are we trying to fix the pieces and so that you can look perfect? Or are we trying to behold the fragment until we find that beautiful and learn from that person and welcome that person's brokenness as if this is sacred? This is, like if we can match Christ's wounds with that person's wounds somehow. It's not easy. It takes enormous amount of commitment. But how do we become a culture that you walk into a church and artists like me who are highly intuitive sense that right away. I can walk into a room full of people and sense, intuitively. I can't even articulate it. I know that these things are happening. There are certain biases or categories created, assumptions made, dysfunctions, emotional codependency, or whatever. I feel that, right? So that's part of the reason why I have to be careful, but also part of the reason why someone like that, who I guarantee you there's someone in your congregation like that. We just haven't perhaps identified that person's gift, like Larry's case. He's don't put him in the leadership. That sounds familiar to me because a lot of artists are like that. Artists think like that. They don't want to be an elder, right? That's why they should be consulted because they're not interested in power. Yeah.
Mako, I'm going to let Sarah and Nick get the rest of the time, but I have to interject one more comment and question based on what you just said to Nancy. I've wanted to find a way in for you to talk just for a moment about your paint making process, because you talked about creation involves mining, like there's stuff in the soil and things we have to dig for. So the question, the reason I think this connects here is when you say, what do we want to become and what do we want to make? I immediately ask a question almost ahead of that one, which is, and how do we want to make it?
Yeah.
I feel like there is such an instantaneous gratification culture, not just surrounding the church, but inside the church. And so part of me as a pastor, I'm so inspired by the vision you just cast. And then I start thinking, no one wants to take so much time making the paints. Like we can buy the paints. So we just sort of, subvert the process. And so I wonder how you would counsel us to be in the slow paint making movement as a church.
Yeah, so slow art, as I've noticed, called slow art movement. I use traditional Japanese way of polarizing pigments and using gold and silver and so forth, handmade, mixed with animal hide glue and painting on handmade paper or silk. And then behind me, you see these two monumental works called Walking on Water, which I will feature in the New York Gallery this fall. One exhibit is to commemorate the 20th anniversary of 9/11 and 10th anniversary of 3/11. Coincidence of this natural disaster and the man-made disaster colliding as two commemorations this year. And the work behind me is using pulverized azurite, which is pigments like this, pulverized by hand by crafts folks in Japan to make these sand-like pigments. And I mix them here by hand, and then I'm using kind of a space age material because they have to be large, and they are literally done not necessarily to create something that's beautiful to sell, but they're really statements and prayers coming out of that intuitive sense that God has given me, and to ask the question, can we walk on water? So artists ask these impossible questions, and we're not trying to answer them. We're just deepening the question, and we're really trying to be honest about what we're feeling, the pain, the brokenness, the cries of our hearts, cries of the earth, cries of our hearts. They all flow out when I paint. So they're considered contemporary art, which is this crazy world of a lot of idols are exposed in contemporary art scene. But I find it very helpful to know that these things are what the culture is worshiping. And I can go into the eye of the storm with the makers and influence perhaps what comes out. And hopefully, like Senno-rikyu, calm the storm a little bit by staying in the eye. But that's kind of how I work.
Sarah, Nick, you guys.
I have so much. Don't get me started here. I love. I hear. I'm going to take one of the words you talked about, this newness.
Yes.
And I'm going to offer the word abundant newness.
Yes.
Because I just kept hearing that idea of that
Totally.
it is.
Mm-hmm.
It's coming from a place of abundance, and I find that I'm working. I have this something I've fallen into. Pastor Bart knows this. Working in this marginal community, this very poor community, and you talked about what are we making, and I kind of want to twist that word a little bit and say, I find myself cultivating.
Yes.
Like cultivating and this. Cultivating a community, cultivating an environment where people can come and just be.
Yes.
Like, do we cultivate and create these spaces? And the arts is so important to that. We're kind of playing with this idea of gardening and the idea of common ground. and inviting people. It's going to be part of our little VBS project in the park, like
Yeah.
having kids plant, having their mothers plant, and joining and doing a common, creative, life-giving something. And that you can't measure that. Like you said,
Right.
the church has this thing about it, and you kind of hinted on this, the whole idea of we make disciples. We have this thing where you make disciples. It looks like this.
Yeah.
And I want to push back and say that's not how I'm seeing it. I'm seeing a very different flavor and different cries and different cries. And I'm seeing scarcity meet abundance in a very different way, in a very different script. And so I think all these things landed for me. Like when you were saying that, I'm like, yes. That's when you get to see the cracks and you get to put gold in there.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, definitely. And I spent considerable time in my previous books of culture care, replacing the industrial metaphor with the gardening environmental stewardship metaphor. And I have gotten to work with Dr. Ellen Davis at Duke, who is a premier theologian on agrarian theology, and to tie in what she does with Wendell Berry and others to bring in this language of cultivation, into whatever we're doing. And to me, what I do in the studio and what I do outside, and I have a small farmland here, and in my garden, cultivating is exactly the same rhythm. It's slow art because you can't force a tulip to come up until it is ready to do so. And I want my art to match with that sense of nature's way. And they tell you where they want to come up to, so I totally get that. My bride, Hejin, is a founder of an organization called Embers International that came out of IJM, International Justice Mission, and we just had a gala where we raised funds to meet the crisis of COVID in India head on, and we talk a lot about this combination of beauty plus justice. What does that look like, and how do we give opportunities to the oppressed, marginalized communities who are given no chance to find that thriving, and trying to advocate for them legally and providing a place for them to find restoration. So all those things are part of Theology of Making. And I think, I talk about this, but in order to connect beauty and justice, you have to have mercy. And mercy and beauty are two things that the Darwinian universe cannot explain. They don't make sense. To have the fittest or the survive, you don't waste time taking care of the poor or homeless or Down syndrome kids. You try to get rid of them. You do the opposite. God's economy works the opposite of the scarcity Darwinian model. So that's what Tom Wright is so correct in saying, that there's model abundance, model beauty doesn't make sense in a scarce land. Why would you paint when the Black Plague has just is killing 1/3 of the population, as Frank Jericho did? Why do you write after experiencing severe trauma in front lines of wars, like Hemingway or J.R. Tolkien or C.S. Lewis or T.S. Eliot? All these people are responding to trauma, severe scarcity, with this vision, language of abundance. So, I totally aligned that. Yeah.
I think that when I heard you say that, my thought was that in order for the church to get there, we would have to slow down our expectations because we want a microwave, right?
Yes.
And all this beauty and all this cultivation, you can't rush it.
Right.
You can't rush a process.
No.
And we don't like your process of the way you make your paints. This
Yeah.
told us this. It's this cultivating.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
the church cannot, the American church, I'm sorry,
Yeah.
cannot grasp
Yeah.
that yet. So everything is, and so the oppressed it's an exchange. It's an exchange for them.
Yeah.
We give you this, go in peace. And it's like the incarnation, we separate ourselves from the incarnational witness because of the process that it takes.
Yeah.
And that is where the beauty lies. And we kind of
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well said, Sarah. Nick, take us home. Back to your 10 years ago tea with Mako. Where are you today after that changed your entire life?
Oh, well, Mako, it's so good to hear you, and it makes my heart happy to hear you as an artist, and it makes me sad that I don't have more of you in my life as a category. And I know we all have sort of and I have friends who are artists like, but they're so often, I think that part of them is diminished in order to be a graphic designer or to exist in whatever commercial ways they have to in a city like San Francisco. So it's just a joy, but it also creates kind of a hole or an awareness of a lack and a desire to say, what can I do to create space for more artists in my life and in the institutions and things I'm a part of. So thank you for being yourself and bringing yourself and making me aware of a whole. So that's a weird thank you, but thank you. But I do have one, it's a question, or it's just, we talk about something, you don't have to remember this. So I'm just going to ask you a question I asked 10 years ago, and I've thought about it a lot of times, but if we have time, we have 10 minutes, 8 minutes, 7 minutes?
Oh, we have time.
All right. We have lots of time, right? We're doing it right now. I had asked you the question because I had been, as a lot of evangelicals, influenced by someone like Francis Schaeffer, who talks about particularly abstract modern Western art as being entirely nihilistic and sort of absent of any kind of, almost feels like absent of any kind of redeeming value. And so I had asked you the question, like, how do you answer that? I know your tradition isn't necessarily Western, but and you kind of gave me kind of an art lesson, and it really reframed how I thought about, in a very profound way, abstract modern Western art. And it was very helpful. So I guess, I don't know if you could do that again, or if you just answer that question, like, how would you describe, or what value is there in abstract modern art? Especially to someone who's maybe heard it's only a reflection of a nihilistic worldview.
Right. And, we all have scapegoating mechanisms, and it makes things easier, but we fall short of the nuance of what's really going on. And, I don't consider myself necessarily a pure abstract artist either. So I want to be careful how we define those terms. Abstraction as tied to pure conceptualism is not what I'm interested in. What I'm interested in is essentiation of reality. So kind of a representation of what is reality with a capital R. So instead of just depicting what can be categorized, I depict with the eyes of my heart, right? So that there's a difference between categorically identifying something like a chair and painting it like Van Gogh does, to get to the heart of who sat on that chair, and why is one of the legs about to break, and all of that story is embedded in an object, tied together with communal realities to realities of that person sitting in front of you, and so a lot of what people think is abstract is not necessarily something that is disembodied. Fireworks, abstract, beautiful pyrotechnic abstraction, music, jazz, classical music, they're all abstract in that sense. They don't have particular, one-to-one correspondences with categories. So what you identify as categories. So those are things that I navigate in and out of, and I also think, especially in American evangelical culture, we are afraid of mystery. So we want to name things. This is conservative, this is liberal, this is abstract, this is realist, this is this is that, Presbyterian, this is Episcopal, and I always remind people that the Holy Spirit doesn't read labels. So even if you're a Christian plumber, if you're not a good plumber, it doesn't really make sense to use Christian as an adjective, right? So let's be a good plumber first, and then we'll worry about how the fruit of the Spirit. By the way, I have a chapter on plumbing theology, and several plumbers have contacted me, and I was like dreading, oh, I'm so sorry, because I use plumbing theology as an example of this pragmatic utilitarian thing. But I do mention that there are kintsugi plumbers in the world. And this one plumber emailed me and said, I was so moved by that because I'm a third generational plumber, and that's exactly who I am. I'm a kintsugi plumber. I don't just fix pipes. I go into people's home to see the presence of the kingdom of God in that place as I work. And later on, somebody who was their customer contacted me, and because they heard this conversation, and he said, "This is absolutely true. Paul is not only a family plumber, but he actually can see where the fractures are in our entire house, and he can identify them before the problem occurs." And he is, so part of our family now, as they hired him as a plumber. Now he's part of the family because he's been such a blessing to them, and that kind of thing happens. So I'm sure there are abstract artists out there that are worthy of our attention as well.
Awesome. Well, Nick, do you have anything else to add before we close this call, take a quick break?
No, thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, Mark,
by the way, I did a thing, Mark Rothko, who's a modern abstract artist. He didn't like that word either. But PBS did if you look up, I think it's called American Masterpieces, and Mark Rothko is featured. They actually interviewed me. And I'm one of the only living artist actually commenting on Rothko. And I talk about that abstraction as an entry point into actually hope and transcendence, because most people see that as nihilistic, as Francis Schaeffer said. And I don't think that's that's a very limited view. You can make that argument clearly. And also my colleague, Bill Durness, has written a book called, Culture and something about modern art and life of culture as opposed to death of culture, that Ruckmacher and Schaeffer wrote. So those are good resources.